The election of 1860 um, was obviously one of the great pivotal elections in American history, or one of the most consequential in terms of its results. And if you look at the campaign year of 1860, it's really quite extraordinary. To start with, um, in 1860, you have the Republican Party, and is the one major party, and the Democrats are the other major party at this point. And the Republican Party was an entirely sectional party. It only had strength in the North. In the South, there wasn't any Republican Party presence at all. And this is significant because you don't have, by this time, you don't have any real national institutions left. Even many Christian denominations had split over the issue of slavery. That's where the Southern Baptists come from, for instance. That split over the issue of slavery. Southern Presbyterians, there's all kinds of Southern Methodists, all kinds of denominations split, as I say, over their stance on the issue of slavery. So the Democratic Party was now the country's only major national institution, but it had a convention early in the year, and it became and represent delegates from the Deep South did not want to see Stephen Douglas nominated for the presidency, and so rather than allow that to happen, they walked out of the convention hall in order to avoid this, and that was because they liked Douglas with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but then in the course of his debates with Lincoln in 1858, one of the key things that Douglas sort of conceded was that if people can say they want to have slavery in a territory, just fine, but if the law enforcement isn't put in place to make slavery possible, to keep enslaved persons wherever they're being kept, farms and factories. There are a lot of slaves who were involved in factory work. We don't think of that often, but it was the case in Baltimore. You had a substantial presence of African Americans in shipyard work. So in Kansas, there's no telling what enslaved persons might be made to do. But wherever they were, whatever they were doing, it was imperative that they weren't able to escape. And what Douglas basically said is slavery is going to be impractical if you don't put the law enforcement mechanism in to enforce it. And Southern slaveholders were just outraged by this admission on Douglas's part, and by this sort of fudging on the issue of allowing slavery in the territory. So they hated his guts after that. So these Deep South delegates, a few weeks later, they met in Baltimore, Maryland, and they nominated John C. Breckinridge, who was then James Buchanan's vice president, the current president. Breckinridge was from Kentucky, and then Breckinridge campaigned on a platform of the unrestricted expansion of slavery anywhere into federal territories. And at this point, by the way, and this is an important point to make, the issue here that's going on between North and South is ideological. I think I might have talked about this before, but the question is, either way, the question is whether the United States was, at its core, a free republic that happened to have pockets of slavery, or was it a slaveholding republic that happened to have pockets of freedom? And the position of Southern Democrats like Breckinridge was that it was a slaveholding republic that happened to have pockets of freedom, and the Republican Party felt the other way around. So that was, this was, a key bone of contention between the two sides. Well, the Republican convention in Chicago ended up nominating Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln was not originally someone that they thought as the nominee of the Republican Party. The most prominent person was a senator from New York, William Seward. Ohio's own Samuel B. Chase was talked about as a real contender for the presidency, but couldn't get a majority for these two and for some of the other major players. And so the the delegates eventually settled on Abraham Lincoln as someone they could all get behind. So Lincoln becomes the presidential nominee, even though he had had exactly one, count them, one 2-year term in the U.S. House of Representatives. That was the sum total of his experience at the federal level. And he had never held any kind of executive authority, never been the governor of a state, anything along those kinds of lines. And now he's the presidential nominee of the Republican Party. So now you've got Douglas has been nominated by the mainline Democratic Party. Breckinridge has been nominated by the Deep South, and then Lincoln has been nominated by the Republicans. Then you have people who are just simply afraid of seeing the dissolution of the Union, and then they create this thing called the Constitutional Union Party, and they nominate a senator from Tennessee named John Bell. So now you've got, in essence, 4 political parties all involved with the election of 1860. And so you end up having 2 presidential contests. In the North, Northeast, Midwest, and so forth, it's between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. In the South, it's between John Breckinridge and John Bell. Lincoln's not even on the ballot in Southern states. There's simply no Republican Party presence in the South. Therefore, there's nobody to put Lincoln's name forward as a candidate in Southern states, and so it just doesn't happen. So you've got basically Southerners are voting for either Breckinridge or Bell. Northerners are voting for either Douglas or Lincoln. And ultimately, of course, Lincoln won with just 40% of the popular vote, but a commanding 59% majority in the Electoral College. And so Southern, what we call fire eaters, extremist politicians, at this point really capitalized on the paranoid style in American politics. And they basically said, hey, look, now the North has a majority in the Electoral College. It's getting to have the bulk of the American population. And what is going to happen now is the Republicans, they just say that they're not interested in slavery in the territories. They're not going to bother slavery where it already exists. Well, don't you believe them? And what we now have to do, we Southerners now have to do, Southern slaveholders and others and other white Southerners, what we have to do now is the only recourse we have against the destruction of slavery, which is the basis for our social system. It's the basis for our economy. The only way we have to protect slavery assuredly is through secession. And on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina, it secedes from the Union. And then over the course of the next couple of months, let's see, from December, January, February, March, you get the number of states in the Deep South that secede, specifically South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas are the ones that secede. So after the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln takes office in March of 1861. Lincoln's at that time, Fort Sumter is almost the only United States Army garrison left in the South. It commands the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina, and the Confederate government insists that the United States remove that garrison and open up the Charleston to regular traffic. I mean, how can you be be an independent country when you've got a foreign power now occupying one of your major ports in terms of entrance and exit from the harbor? Lincoln refuses to remove those troops, and on April 12th, 1861, Confederate artillery ringing Charleston Harbor fires upon Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter surrenders on April 14th, 1861, and then the following day, April 15th, Lincoln announces that forces too powerful, a combination too powerful for ordinary law enforcement to resist, have taken control in these southern states. And so he calls upon 75,000 militia to serve for 90 days to put this rebellion down. And people think, well, wait a second. I mean, just 75,000 militia for 90 days. What does he think that the war is going to be over on the basis of 75,000 men in 90 days? Well, Lincoln doesn't necessarily think that at all. What he is drawing upon is a law made very early in the Republic's history in the 1790s, giving presidents of the United States the authority to call out militia on their own when Congress is not in session. And there are certain rules governing this. And one of the rules is, in terms of militia, the president has the authority to call them out for 90 days, and that's it. But at that point, it becomes clear that the United States government is prepared to hold the Union together at the point of the bayonet. And so you now have the exit of several more southern states from the Union over this question of how the Union is going to be maintained, and now it's going to be maintained through force. So Virginia leaves the Union, then Tennessee does, and then Arkansas leaves. And so North Carolina, I was looking for the fourth one. Yeah, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Those four leave. And now you've got 11 states in the that have now left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. What happens next, of course, is a 4-year war. The worst conflict in United States history by far. We used to think that 620,000 Americans perished during that struggle. That was for a long time, that was considered to be the sort of the accepted figure. Then in recent years, a historian did really compelling and convincing demographic work, a demographic study to demonstrate that the number of people killed during the American Civil War in total was probably closer to 800,000. So even at 620,000 people, you're dealing with 2% of the American population of 27 million at that time. When you get up to 800,000 people, you're looking at closer to 3%. This photograph shows Confederate dead in what was called the Sunken Road, or what Bloody Lane, at Antietam, a battle fought on September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest single day in American military history. And this was just one of numerous battles. Only one would say the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. More men were killed in that one battle than all previous American wars combined. And so the scale of this bloodshed was just absolutely shocking to everyone. And so this level of bloodshed just sort of seemed like it was out of proportion to any rational political aim. There was a staunchly abolitionist senator from Massachusetts named Henry Wilson. And in 1864, he went to the fighting front. He's in Virginia. He saw all the dead and wounded, just particularly the tremendous number of just dead, military dead produced by the campaigns. And he said, if that scene could have been presented to me before the war, anxious as I was for the preservation of the Union, I should have said, the cost is too great. Erring sisters, go in peace. And by sisters, he means the sister states. Now, nowadays, we take these enormous casualties of the Civil War for granted. But the fact that Americans inflicted and absorbed such losses for 4 years is arguably the greatest single manifestation of the revolutionary nature of that conflict. After all, the regional differences between the North and South had been evident since the nation's founding. American statesmen had argued about the place of slavery in the United States as far back as the Continental Congress, and yet until 1860, Americans, and I really should need to say here white Americans, had always found a way to resolve the argument within the political system. And this American tradition of compromise was one of its proudest and most successful traditions. So, what could have occurred to make it vanish so utterly during the Civil War years? Well, Charles Royster, who I quoted a while back, to quote him again, and other historians have concluded that it stemmed, this revolutionary conflict, this unwillingness to compromise over anything, they concluded that it stemmed from extreme political rhetoric that flowed in torrents in the decades before the war. Americans, Royster wrote, did not invent new methods of drastic war during the Civil War as much as they made real a version of the conflict that many of them had talked about from the start. So you have, a rhetoric that talks about, your political opponents as being an utter threat to liberty, to be opposed at all costs, and then they view, your side as a threat to liberty, to be opposed at all costs as well. And there's no room for compromise. This is a fight to the death. And so perception becomes reality. Perceptions generated in the 1850s become reality in the 1860s. And the American Republic is very nearly destroyed. The thing about republics, historically, is that they're mortal. Unlike monarchies, unlike empires, unlike other forms of government, republics go away, and they go away for two reasons. Either they've become so volatile that people look for anyone who could provide order. This was something that happened when Napoleon Bonaparte took over in the wake of the French Revolution, and the way that Vladimir Putin was able to consolidate his power in Russia after the end of communism. So there's that, or things fall apart completely, which is what began to happen in the United States during the American Civil War. And what Lincoln feared was that this was just going to be the first division of several, if the Confederacy was allowed to win. So, and nowadays republics tend to be documentaries, and democracies die currently, but in a different way than happened during the American Civil War, but no less surely. I'd like for you to listen to this excerpt from one of the authors of an influential book called "How Democracies Die." We'll end just about on this note. Okay.
My name is Daniel Ziblatt. I'm a professor of government at Harvard University. I've co-written a book with my co-author Steve Levitsky called How Democracies Die. Really 3 points from the book I think are really worth emphasizing. Number one, the way democracies has died over time has changed. During the Cold War, most democracies died through military coups. Since the end of the Cold War, the way that democracies die is through elections at the hands of elected leaders. Politicians get elected, come to office, and then once in office, dismantle democratic institutions. Number two, the question then becomes, how do we prevent demagogues, people who have authoritarian inclinations, from using democratic institutions to come to power and then dismantle them? How do we prevent them from coming to power in the first place? Historically, the way this has happened is through political parties and politicians, establishment politicians, having the political courage to draw a line in the sand and say, we will not cooperate with these demagogues. when politicians have failed to do this, whether in 1930s Germany, whether in 1990s Venezuela, whether 1920s Italy, in all of those instances, mainstream politicians see a demagogue on the horizon, and rather than drawing a line in the sand and saying, we will not cooperate with these figures, in each of those instances, mainstream politicians think they can tap into the popularity of these outside demagogues. And so in Italy, mainstream politicians embraced Mussolini. In Germany, mainstream politicians embraced Adolf Hitler. And in 1990s Venezuela, mainstream politicians embraced Hugo Chavez. In each instance, a kind of Faustian bargain was formed where political leaders thought they could tap into the popularity of these guys, but in every instance, these bargains backfired, and the outside demagogues came to power, posing an existential threat to democracies. The third big point is this. Once a demagogue is in office, what happens? The game has really changed, and democracy is fundamentally challenged when you have authoritarians in power. In the United States, we tend to think that our checks and balances will constrain authoritarian demagogues. That's the way the system was designed, to constrain the power of overreaching politicians. In many ways, our checks and balances is an ingenious system that works quite well. But one thing we haven't really fully appreciated is that our checks and balances rely on a set of unwritten rules. Our Constitution is really a short document. And at the end of the day, our Constitution doesn't enforce itself. It requires political leaders committed to norms of mutual toleration, norms of self-restraint, to protect the democracy. I mean, the Constitution only works when they behave in ways that have allowed our democracy to work over the last several hundred years. So as polarization has come to American politics, as it has in other countries around the world, these norms have become frayed. Politicians increasingly view each other as existential threats. Rather than viewing each other simply as rivals, they view each other as enemies. And the degree to which we do that, and we see this around the world and as well as in the United States, democracy is much more fragile. So the task ahead that we conclude is to think about ways of repairing our political system, to treat each other no longer as enemies, as simply rivals with competing visions for politics. People need to fight hard for what they believe in, but citizens as well as political leaders need to treat each other with respect. We think the United States faces a set of challenges, but in many ways, the United States is a very old democracy, a very rich democracy, and we really think that the U.S. can repair itself, but we face challenges that we've never faced before.
When I first gave a version of this lecture, the one that you've just seen back in May 2011, I concluded by saying this, quote, "Nowadays, when Americans think about the Civil War, they still typically do so with a sense of nostalgia." And to repeat a point that I made several times during that presentation, they think that democracy is easy. They see little problem with exporting democracy to other countries, even though those devoid of the history, the institutions, or political culture necessary to sustain it. That's what happened in Afghanistan. That's what happened in Iraq recently. Nor do they see danger in the extreme present day partisanship, a renewal of this paranoid style of politics that between 1830 and 1860 pushed the republic off a cliff. And in so doing, they overlook a central lesson of the American Civil War. Far from being easy, democracy is extraordinarily hard. And the American Civil War, with its loss of 3% of the American population, could not possibly underscore this more forcefully. I'm giving this presentation in the spring of 2023. At this particular time, there's still a lot of concern that in future years, democracy will remain in peril. And sometimes the question is asked to me, well, are we going to have another civil war? And not necessarily, and probably not. But is it possible that our democracy will go away in favor of some kind of authoritarian government? Yeah. Yeah, that's a real possibility. Political rhetoric as of the spring of 2023 has become so extreme that when you ask parents, hey, would you, that like if you're a parent of Democrats, hey, would you like to see your daughter, date a Republican? They're like, no. And the same thing in reverse. That's how absurd this political partisanship has become, and it tracks back to this kind of performance art in which talk show radio hosts, and then you see this on cable news, um, you know, continually present the other side in extreme terms. And nowadays, they do it very often by cherry picking, episodes and things that people on the other side, have said, to create and then generalize the whole side. The other side believes this crazy, crazy thing, um, to create a perception that the other side is simply you can't bargain with them, you can't compromise with them. They are a complete and utter threat, to your own way of life. This is and so at this point, people begin to lose faith in the democratic process, and that's when they're likely to turn to some kind of authoritarian government. In the American South, we think, well, maybe the United States was just going to change from, one republic to two republics, and what's the problem with that? The fact of the matter is, the Confederate States of America became quite quickly an authoritarian state, a kind of a military oligarchy, in which Jefferson Davis and his cabinet and a few top generals really controlled what went on in the Confederacy. And out of a need to try and manufacture enough ammunition and other kinds of things to take on the federal government, by the middle of the Civil War, around about 1863, the Confederate States of America had become one of the most remorselessly centralized countries on earth. So the idea that the Confederacy remained a republic in any meaningful sense of the term is somewhat naive. Now, I think that at this point, again, the spring of 2023, many Americans are waking up to the reality that our democracy is in real peril. But the toxic political culture and the persistence of this paranoid style in American politics means that they often believe, again, that the threat comes entirely from their political adversaries. And this tendency towards stark division in American politics, as of the time I'm giving this lecture, really shows no signs of changing. And so, as I did in 2011, when I first gave this presentation, I leave you with this warning from the Greek playwright Sophocles. Far-stretching, endless time brings forth all hidden things and buries that which once did shine. The firm resolve falters, the sacred oath is shattered, and let none say it cannot happen